It's September 24th, 1886, Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. Geronimo, the Apache chief who dodged bullets and armies for decades, stands surrounded, his rifle lowered, his few remaining warriors exhausted. After years of outsmarting the U.S. military, he's forced to surrender, not because he's weak, but because the odds are insane. 5,000 American troops, a quarter of the entire U.S. Army at the time, sent to hunt down him and his band of less than 40. That's 125 soldiers per Apache. Historians call it overkill. Skeptics might argue it proves how terrified the U.S. was of these rabid warriors who refused to give up their land. The Apache didn't just fight, they defined resistance in the Wild West, clashing with Spanish, Mexicans, and Americans across centuries. But who were these people who turned mountains into fortresses and struck fear into empires? And what drove them to keep fighting when everyone else had given up? Let's step back to when the United States was just beginning to form. Back then, North American indigenous nations and tribes weren't just watching from the sidelines. They were right in the thick of it, shaping how this country came together. Before there were cities or railroads, these groups were out there trading, fighting, and surviving, laying the groundwork for everything that came later. They played a huge role in the founding history of the U.S., no question about it. But when you zoom in on the Wild West, one group keeps standing out, the Apache Indians. Now, the Wild West wasn't some empty stretch of land waiting for cowboys and settlers to show up. It was packed with indigenous cultures, each doing their part as the U.S. started pushing west in the 1800s. Most of those groups got swept up in the chaos of colonization, but the Apache? They didn't just play a role, they owned it. While plenty of tribes were part of that story, few matched the Apache for how big an impact they made. Why? Because they didn't roll over when outsiders came knocking. They fought hard to keep what was theirs. Picture settlers pouring into New Mexico after the U.S. took it over in 1848, or gold-hungry migrants cutting through Apache territory in 1849 on their way to California. Where other groups got pushed aside or faded away, the Apache turned every clash into a battle, holding their ground against wave after wave of intruders. And here's the kicker. These weren't people who gave up easy. They were rabid warriors, fierce and relentless, refusing to let go of their land no matter how bad things got. By the late 1800s, they were staring down the full might of the U.S. government, not to mention Spanish and Mexican forces from way back in the 17th century. The odds kept piling up against them. Think armies, broken promises, and settlers hungry for gold, silver, and coal. Take the Apache Wars, dragging on until 1886, when Geronimo finally had to call it quits. Decades of fighting, and they still wouldn't back down. Some might call that crazy. Others see it as pure grit, a testament to how much their homeland meant to them. Whatever you think, it's clear the Apache didn't just live through the Wild West. They helped define it. So who exactly were the Apache? Let's break it down. These weren't just one random tribe. They were a whole network of culturally connected groups spread across the southwestern United States. Think of them as a family of tribes, each with their own vibe, but tied together by shared roots. One big link? They're distant cousins to the Navajo. Both groups speak versions of this language called Athabascan, which you can still hear echoes of across the western U.S. today. That connection goes way back, tying them to a bigger story of indigenous people moving and settling over centuries. The Apache weren't newcomers. They were part of something ancient and deep. Now, where did they call home? Their territory was massive, a chunk of land people later nicknamed Apacharia. We're talking eastern Arizona, northern Mexico, New Mexico, western Texas, and southern Colorado. That's a serious stretch, covering deserts, mountains, and plains, all of it theirs long before borders or states were even a thing. This wasn't some tiny corner they stuck to. It was a wide-open playground that shaped who they were and how they lived. You try keeping tabs on a place that big, it's no wonder they became legends for knowing every inch of it. And how did they live? The early Apache were nomads, always on the move, roaming from as far south as Mexico up into the U.S. They didn't sit still, they followed the land and what it could give them. Most of them were hunters and gatherers, masters at tracking game and finding food in tough spots. Some groups went after buffalo, stalking those huge herds across the plains, while others stuck closer to home and did a little farming on the side, just enough to get by. It wasn't a settled life with big villages or permanent fields. It was fluid, adaptable, built around survival and freedom. That nomadic streak didn't just keep them alive, it made them hard to pin down when trouble came knocking. And trust me, trouble showed up plenty. Let's dive into how the Apache lived day to day, their culture, their way of doing things. Start with their homes. They had two main setups depending on what they needed. First, there were wickiups, these dome-shaped houses built to last a while. Picture a frame of skinny tree saplings bent into a curve, then covered with bark or grass to keep out the wind and sun. Those were their more permanent spots, places they'd stick around in for a bit. Then you've got teepees, the total opposite. These were tents, quick to set up and take down, perfect for when they were chasing buffalo across the plains. Light, portable, ready to roll whenever the hunt called. It was all about flexibility with the Apache, matching their houses to their on-the-go life. Moving stuff around was a big deal too, and they had a smart way to do it, the Travois. Think of it like a sled, just two poles tied together with a platform, loaded up with tents and gear. Early on, dogs were the ones pulling these travois, trotting along as the Apache moved camp. But then the Europeans showed up sometime around the 1500s, bringing horses to the Americas. That was a game changer. Horses were bigger, stronger, could haul way more than dogs ever did. Suddenly, the travois got supersized, carrying piles of belongings, and the Apache started making bigger tents to match. It wasn't just about moving easier. It let them live larger on the road. What about how they dressed? Apache warriors didn't go for those flashy feathered headdresses you might picture. That wasn't their style. Most of them rocked simple leather or cloth headbands, practical and no fuss. Except for the Plains Apache, they picked up a trick from their Kiowa buddies and started wearing feathered headdresses. But for the rest, it was all about keeping it basic, focused on what worked over what looked cool. Ceremonies were a different story, though. That's where they brought out the special stuff. For religious rituals, they'd wear wooden masks and these unique headdresses, totally separate from everyday gear. Face paint was a big deal, too, and it wasn't random. They'd switch up the designs depending on what was going down, a spiritual ceremony or a battle prep. Each pattern had its own meaning, tying them to their beliefs or pumping them up for a fight. And leadership? That was something they took seriously. The Apache picked their chiefs democratically, not by bloodline or force, but by respect. You had to earn it. If a candidate didn't have the tribe's trust, he wouldn't last long. They'd swap him out for someone who did. It wasn't just about power, it was about connection. The bond between the people and their leader had to be rock solid, because out there in Apacharia, trust was everything when survival was on the line. In the 1600s, the Apache were already clashing with Spanish and Mexican invaders. These weren't small fights. The Spanish came with conquistadors, and later the Mexicans pushed into Apache territory, trying to take it over. The Apache fought back hard, defending their mountains and deserts with everything they had. This was about keeping their land, and they made it a brutal struggle. Around 1750, the Comanche turned up the heat on the Central Plains. The horse and gun trade exploded, giving them speed and firepower. They hit the Plains Apache relentlessly, forcing them to move south and west. It wasn't weakness, it was survival, shifting to tougher ground where they could hold out. Getting displaced like that shook things up, and the Apache had to adapt fast. After 1750, those pushed out Apache ramped up their raids. They struck other tribes and settlers, grabbing food and livestock to stay alive. These weren't random hits. They were desperate moves to feed their people after losing ground. The Comanche had taken their old spots, and now anyone nearby was a target. It was messy, and they were right in the thick of it. In 1848, the U.S. took New Mexico, right in the heart of Apache land during westward expansion. Settlers and migrants started crossing through, treating it like a free pass. The Apache didn't let it slide. They kept raiding, hitting wagons and camps, anyone who stepped on their turf. This wasn't just aggression, it was a clear signal. This land's ours, and you're not staying. Even with the U.S. flexing its power and more settlers showing up, the Apache held their ground, fighting outsiders like they'd done for centuries. The Chiricahua, known as the Apaches of the Great Mountain, called southeastern Arizona home. They were the fiercest tribe in Arizona, no contest. Their raids stretched across New Mexico, southern Arizona, and even down into northern Sonora in Mexico. These guys didn't mess around, hitting hard and fast wherever they went. Leading them were some heavy hitters. Coach Ice, born around 1812 and dying in 1874, kept the fight alive for years. Nietzsche, less famous but just as tough. And Geronimo, born 1829, dead 1909, a name that still echoes today. They made the Chiricahua a force nobody could ignore. The Jicarilla started way up in Canada, part of 6 groups that headed south between 1300 and 1500. They landed in the southwest, claiming a huge spread, 50 million acres. That's about 20.2 million hectares. Their territory covered northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and western Oklahoma. That's a massive chunk of land, and they settled in, adapting to the plains and mountains. They weren't as loud as some tribes, but their reach showed how far the Apache could stretch. The Mescalero were fierce nomadic warriors roaming Texas, Arizona, and Mexico. They lived on the move, hunting and fighting, never pinned down. Between 1700 and 1750, the Comanche pushed them out of the southern plains in central Texas, a brutal shove that sent them scrambling. They didn't give up, though. They took refuge in the mountains of New Mexico, West Texas, and Mexico, turning rugged terrain into their stronghold. When it came to defending their homeland, the Mescalero brought a vicious edge that made enemies think twice. In the late 1800s, the Apache were locked in a brutal showdown with the U.S. government over their land. The aggression was non-stop, settlers and soldiers pushing in, trying to take it all. Out of that chaos, leaders like Cochise and Geronimo stepped up. Cochise was a rock, keeping the resistance alive through sheer will, while Geronimo became the face of Apache defiance, dodging capture for years. They weren't just fighting battles, they were fighting for their whole way of life. Everything kicked off in 1849, when gold got discovered in San Francisco. The California gold rush sent thousands of Americans streaming west, cutting right through Apache territory. Tensions boiled over fast. These weren't just travelers passing by, they were trampling sacred ground, setting up camp, and sparking clashes. That's when the Apache Wars really ignited, a string of fights that wouldn't let up for decades. From 1861 to 1865, the U.S. Civil War slowed down that westward flood a bit, but the Apache didn't get a break. They took on both Union and Confederate forces, didn't pick a side, just saw them all as threats. To them, blue or gray didn't matter. Anyone stepping on their land was an enemy. They kept defending their turf, even as the country tore itself apart around them. After 1865, things got uglier. The U.S. started breaking treaties left and right, kicking the Apache off their land to clear space for settlers. Gold, silver, and coal mining ramped up, tearing into Apache territory, and the government tried shoving them onto reservations. The Apache said no way. They hated those cramped, controlled patches, refused to trade their freedom for it. That defiance fueled years of clashes, a back and forth that drained both sides. On September 24, 1886, it all came to a head. Geronimo surrendered at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, after years on the run. His band was down to a handful, worn out, surrounded by thousands of U.S. troops. That marked the end of the Apache Wars, the last big stand. But it wasn't over for the Chiricahua. After 1886, they got ripped from the West, held as prisoners of war for 27 years. From 1886 to 1913, stuck in Florida, Alabama, and Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Miles from home, locked up like criminals. In 1913, the Chiricahua finally got a choice. They could take land plots in Oklahoma or move to the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico. After decades of fighting and exile, it was a bitter end to a long road, a chance to start over, but nowhere near the freedom they'd bled for. In 2000, the U.S. Census counted 57,000 people who said they were fully Apache, no mix, just straight-up Apache blood. Another 40,000 claimed some Apache ancestry, part of the family tree but blended with other roots. That's nearly 100,000 people tied to this legacy, a solid number showing the Apache didn't just fade away after all the fighting. They're still here, still counting. These days, a lot of Apache folks live on reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. Life's different now, not the nomadic warrior days anymore. They're into farming, growing crops to keep things steady. Ranching's big too, raising cattle and working the land. And then there's tourism. Businesses that bring in outsiders to see their world, share a piece of their story. It's practical stuff, making a living while staying rooted in those old territories of Apacharia. Even with all that modern grind, they haven't let go of the past. Ancestral beliefs still run deep, traditions like ceremonies and stories passed down through generations. They're living in 2025 now, sure, but they're keeping that Apache spirit alive, blending it with today's reality. It's not just survival, it's holding on to who they are, no matter how much the world's changed around them. The name Apache might come from the Zuni word for enemy, a label slapped on by neighbors who felt their sting. It's not hard to see why. That word stuck because it fit. Their bravery in battle made them a force nobody could brush off. They weren't just scrapping to win, they were fighting to be remembered, and that name carries that weight even now. When Europeans rolled in around the 1500s, they brought horses, and that flipped everything for the Apache. Suddenly, they weren't just walking or using dogs to haul gear. They were riding, moving faster, hitting harder. Those bigger Travois and tents. Horses made that possible. Warfare got a boost too. They could strike and vanish before anyone knew what hit them. It wasn't just a tool. It was a total shift in how they lived and fought. But the story's got a rough edge. The wars, the broken treaties, it all piles up to a big injustice. The U.S. took their land, piece by piece, starting with New Mexico in 1848, then pushing harder after 1865 with mining and settlers. Promises got trashed, and the Apache ended up with reservations or exile, like the Chiricahua, locked away for 27 years. It's a stark look at how much they lost, how oppression steamrolled over them. Still, their struggle screams courage. They didn't just roll over when the Spanish, Mexicans, or Americans came knocking. From the 1600s to Geronimo's last stand in 1886, they showed determination that's hard to match. Protecting their homeland wasn't a choice. It was who they were. That fight, that grit, it's why the Apache aren't just a history lesson. They're a symbol of standing tall, no matter the odds.